Okay, how's it going, everybody? We're going to get back to this book called The Spanish Inquisition, written by, let me get this right, Henry Kamen, 1998. So we're going to read chapter 10. This is The End of Morisco, Spain. Let's go ahead and get into it. So it starts out with the quote: "We were taken to the Inquisition where, for no more than following the truth, we were deprived of life, of property, and of children. The 17th century Morisco exile in Tunis." So we'll go ahead and get into this. For a while in the Middle Ages, it seemed as if all Spain would go Muslim. Occupied by consecutive waves of invaders from North Africa, the peninsula remained in places under Muslim control for nearly 7 centuries. Consequently, the peoples who thus entered Spanish history were no less a part of its structure than the Christian and Jewish population. They intermarried with them and exchanged ideas and languages, so that the three religions developed side by side within the Spanish kingdoms. The Reconquest changed all this. The Christian advance took Saragossa in 118, Cordoba in 1236, Valencia in 1238, and Sevilla in 1248. Finally, after a long interval, the 10-year war ended with the fall of Granada in 1492. The end of the kingdom of Al-Andalus meant that the Muslims, known among Spaniards as Moors, ceased to exist as a nation and became no more than a minority within a Christian country. As subjects of a Christian king, they were now like the Muslims who had for centuries lived under Christian rule, known as Mudejares. The terms of the capitulation of Granada were generous to the vanquished and reflected medieval traditions of convivencia. The Mudejares were guaranteed their customs, property, laws, and religion. They kept their own officials, to be supervised, however, by Castilian governors. Those wishing to immigrate were allowed to do so. The reality of the settlement was somewhat different from these terms. Many of the elite found life under Christian rule intolerable and passed over into North Africa. Reorganization of the territory was entrusted to Inigo Lopez de Mendoza, second Count of Tendilla, and later first Marquis of Mondejar. Hernando de Talavera was appointed for first Archbishop and encouraged conversions by means of charitable persuasion, respect for Mudejar culture, and the use of Arabic during religious services. Progress was slow, and in 1499, Cisneros asked Fernand and Isabella, who were then in Granada, for permission to pursue a more vigorous policy. There appear to have been no compulsory conversions, but the policy of mass baptisms provoked a brief revolt in December in 1499. In the Albayquin, the Muslim quarter of Granada, the rising was appeased only through the good offices of Tendilla and Talavera. There were further scattered revolts in other parts of the south through most of the 1500s and into the early weeks of 1501. They presented the government with a serious policy problem. Some, including Tendilla and Cisneros, favored harsh measures. Cisneros' view was that by rebellion the Mudejares had forfeited all rights granted by the terms of capitulation, and they should be offered a clear choice between baptism or expulsion. His personal preference was, quote, that they be converted and enslaved, for as slaves they will be better Christians, and the land will be pacified forever, end quote. Ferdinand, by contrast, favored moderation. Quote, if your horse trips up, he told his counselors, quote, you don't seize your sword to kill him, instead you give him a smack on his flanks. So my view, and that of the Queen, is that these Moors be baptized. If they don't become Christians, their children and grandchildren will. End quote. It was an important indication of the widely different policy that the monarchs would adopt towards the Muslims in Castile and those in Aragon. In Granada and Castile, as Ferdinand saw it, circumstances made conversion inevitable. In Aragon, there was as yet no need for that approach. Over the next few months, the Mudejares of Granada were systematically baptized. A few were allowed to emigrate. By 1501, it was officially assumed that the kingdom had become one of Christian Muslims, the Moriscos. They were granted legal equality with Christians. but were forbidden to carry arms and were subjected to pressure to abandon their culture. A huge bonfire of Arabic books, ordered by royal decree of October 1501, was held in Granada. It was the end of the capitulations and of Muslim al-Andalus. Quote, "If the king of the conquest does not keep faith," end quote, lamented a contemporary Arab leader and scholar, Yusef Benegas, at that time resident on his estates near Granada. Quote, "What can we expect from his successors?" End quote. With Granada apparently converted, Isabella was not inclined to tolerate Muslims elsewhere in her realms. On the 12th of February, 1502, Almodejares in Castile were offered the choice between baptism and exile. Virtually all of them, subjects of the crown since the Middle Ages, chose baptism, since immigration was rendered almost impossible by its stringent conditions. With their conversion, Islam vanished from Castilian territory and continued to be tolerated only in the crown of Aragon. The different policy adopted in two realms demonstrated that unity of religion was not an immediate priority of the crown. By repeating a step that had already been taken against the Jews, Isabella abolished plurality of faiths in her dominions of Castile, but also created within the body of Christian society the wholly new problem of the Moriscos. From about 1511, various decrees attempted to make the new converts modify their cultural identity and abandon Muslim practices. These measures culminated in an assembly convoked by authorities in Granada in 1526. At the meeting, all the distinctive characteristics of Morisco civilization, the use of Arabic, their clothes, their jewelry, the ritual slaughter of animals, circumcision, came under attack. A decree was passed encouraging intermarriage between old Christians and Moriscos. It was also decided to transfer the local tribunal of the Inquisition from Jaén to Granada. In the crown of Aragon, there was no comparable pressure on the Mudejares. The principal reason for this was the great power of the landed nobility and the authority of the Cortes. On the estates of the nobles, the Mudejares formed a plentiful, cheap, and productive source of labor, from which the expression arose, mientras más moros, más ganancia, more Muslims, more profit. Whether the placate his nobility or in pursuit of a moderate policy, Ferdinand repeatedly warned the inquisitors of Aragon not to persecute the Mudejar population or resort to forced conversions. The Mudejares therefore continued to lead an independent existence until the revolt of the Comuneros in 1520. At the same time that the comunidades of 1520 broke out in Castile, Valencia experienced disturbances of its own. Here the rebels, grouped into Hermanias or brotherhoods, organized an urban revolution directed against the local aristocracy. Valencia had the second largest Muslim population of any province in Spain. The Mudejares were almost exclusively a rural community that were subjected to the big landowners of the realm. The Hermania leaders saw that the simplest way to destroy the power of the nobles in the countryside would be to free their vassals, and this they did by baptizing them. Years 1520 to 1522 in Valencia thus witnessed the forcible baptism of thousands of Muslims. The defeat of the rebels by royal troops should in theory have allowed the Mudejares to revert to Islam, since forced baptisms were universally regarded as invalid. But the authorities were not so eager to lose their new converts. The Inquisition in particular was concerned to hold the Mudejares to the letter of their baptism. To the argument that the conversions had taken place under compulsion, the standard answers was once again given to that to choose baptism as an alternative to death meant the exercise of free choice, which rendered the sacrament of baptism valid. The Inquisition was therefore ordered to proceed on the assumption that all properly administered baptisms were valid. The Crown of Aragon, in November 1525, Charles V issued a decree in ordering the conversion of all Mudejares in Valencia by the end of the year, and of those elsewhere by the end of January 1526. In 1526, the Muslim religion no longer existed in Spain officially. All Mudejares were now Moriscos. Writing to the Pope in December that year, Charles V admitted that, quote, the conversion was not wholly voluntary among many of them, and since Then they have not been instructed in our holy faith." End quote. Considerable efforts were subsequently made to evangelize the new converts in the regions of the greatest concentration. Evangelize the new converts in the regions of greatest concentration. Among the clergy leading the campaign was the distinguished humanist Antonio de Guevara, who labored in Valencia and Granada. The situation of the Moriscos varied across the peninsula according to the density of population. The highest concentration was in the Kingdom of Granada, where Moriscos in the 1560s were some 54% of the population. In areas such as Alpujarra Mountains, they constituted the totality. In Valencia, they formed a third of the population in the late 16th century. In Aragon, about a fifth. In Catalonia, Moriscos were a tiny group, and in Castile, they were proportionately even less. Perhaps a total sum of 20,000 in 1502, scattered throughout the country in small urban groupings and living at peace with their Christian neighbors. There were major differences between the Morisco communities. The Granadians, recently subjugated, including a flourishing upper class, preserved their religion and culture intact and usually spoke Arabic, Algarabia, the Christians called it. They were an integral Islamic civilization. The Valencians were largely a rural proletariat, but because they lived quite separately from the Christian population and were so numerous, they managed to preserve the most of their customs, religion, and language. Elsewhere in Spain, Arabic was almost unknown among the Moriscos. All spoke a form of Castilian. In Aragon, where Mudejares had lived longest among Christians, the decline of Arabic produced the beginnings of the 16th century of a Morisco literature written in Spanish. Residual knowledge of Arabic, however, was sufficient to warrant the import of sacred texts from abroad. Aragonese Moriscos, for the most part, lived and dressed like their Christian neighbors. They differed only in religion. Though deprived of access to Christian society by discrimination, the Moriscos were not uniformly poor. As a separate community, they had an economic life parallel to that of Christians. The majority worked the land, but in Aragon, they also herded flocks of sheep and cattle for the market. In Saragossa, they were carpenters, metalworkers, and cloth workers. They were active in the building industry and produced swords and arms for sale. Some were traders, investing in their profits in the land. In towns wholly populated by Moriscos, such as Almonacid de la Sierra in Aragon, the inhabitants logically produced their own liberal professions: a surgeon, a scrivener, a lawyer, a noble, in addition to lesser callings. To maintain their internal integrity, the Muslim leaders strengthened the social role of their community, the Ahama. It was an institution that was allowed to preserve their autonomy and culture, but at the same time made it possible to cooperate on good terms with the authorities. They spoke among themselves the version of Spanish known as Alhamania. When written down in Arabic script, this produced a secret literature that the inquisitors were unable to read and that they normally categorized when they discovered and confiscating such writings as Qurans. Until the early years of the reign of Philip II, the efforts of the Inquisition to keep Moriscos to their nominal Christianity were little more than a gesture. The largest numbers to be prosecuted were in the Crown of Aragon, but they were only the tip of the iceberg of unbelief in Morisco Spain. There are two main reasons for the relative absence of prosecutions: the conviction of both church and the state that a proper program of conversion should be undertaken, and the strong opposition of Christian seigneurs to any interference with their rights over their Morisco vassals. In Aragon, for instance, nearly 70% of the Moriscos were under noble jurisdiction. In January of 1526, the leaders of the Valencian Moriscos succeeded in obtaining from the crown and the Inquisitor General Manrique a secret concordia or agreements that if they had submitted to baptism, they would be free for 40 years from any prosecution by the Holy Office, since it would be impossible for them to shed all their customs at once. In 1528, the Concordia was made public, and in that same year, the Cortes of Aragon, meeting at Monzon, asked Charles to prevent the Inquisition from prosecuting Moriscos until they had been instructed in the faith. The request was timely, for the guarantee was no more lasting than the one granted to the Mudejares of Granada. The Holy Office interpreted the Concordia to mean that it would bring to trial those converts who had slipped back into Islamic practices. Sorry, I'll make sure I'm on the right page here. In December of 1526, the year when the Inquisition was transferred from Jaén to Granada, regulations were reissued forbidding Granadan Moriscos to use the Arab language, Muslim clothes, or Muslim names. Morisco money offered to Charles brought about the suspension of these rules. But the removal of one burden was balanced by the imposition of another in the form of the Inquisition, whose activity the Moriscos continued to try to curtail over the next generation. In Aragon, protests raised against the Inquisition in the Cortes of Monzon of 1533 included claims that the tribunal was seizing land confiscated from its victims, to the detriment of the feudal owners of the land. Similar complaints were raised in the Cortes of 1537 and 1542. In 1546, the Pope intervened and agreed that for a minimum period of 10 years, the Inquisition should not confiscate any property from the Moriscos. Only the year after this, however, we find the Cortes of Valencia stating that the tribunal was disregarding such injunctions. It was after great difficulty that finally, in 1571, the Inquisition showed itself open to compromise. The resulting Concordia was embodied in a decree of October 1571, by which, in return for an annual payment of 2,500 ducats to the Inquisition, the tribunal agreed not to confiscate or sequestrate the property of Moriscos on trial for heresy. Monetary fines could be levied, but with a limit of 10 ducats only. The agreement benefited all sides. The Inquisition, since it brought in a regular annual revenue, the Moriscos, since it protected property from members of their families, and the lords of the Moriscos, since it preserved lands they had leased to their Morisco dependents. The religious problem and the activities of the Inquisition aggravated the position of the Moriscos and provoked many of the conflicts of this period. Spanish writers later claimed that these events led logically to the decision to expel the Moriscos. In reality, expulsion was never inevitable. There was little difference between the tensions of the time and the equally tense convivencia of the Middle Ages. Islamic civilization was able to cope with the pressures placed on it. Christian society, for its part, regularly turned a blind eye to the Islamic activities of the Moriscos. The Moriscos still retained many of their old social customs and fought to preserve their own religion. They gradually came to realize that some compromises would have to be made. Forced to conform to Christianity, they sought advice from their leaders. In about 1504, a mufti living in Oran, North Africa, issued a fatwa, or opinion, on the situation of Muslims living in Spain. He ruled that in times of persecution, Muslims could conform to virtually all outward rules of Christianity, without defecting from their beliefs. This ruling, which permitted taqiyya, dispensation from religious obligations when under persecution, circulated in texts among the Moriscos in the 1560s. The practice made it possible for Moriscos to cling on to their religion. It also enabled them to live in their own country, Spain, on terms that they could in some measure decide for themselves. In many parts of the peninsula, consequently, there continued to be a practical convivencia between old Christians and new Christians of Muslim origin. The towns of Arcos de Medinaceli, on the estates of the Duke of Medinaceli, near the frontier of Castile with Aragon, was in the 1550s, 9/10 Morisco in population. The Moriscos played their due part in the financial and political administration of the town, sharing municipal posts equally with old Christians. When Moriscos were buried, old Christians attended the funeral. It was a poor community, which may explain the absence of anything beyond the formal signs of Christianity in the religion of the Moriscos. But there is clear evidence that many of them, even though formerly Catholic, also had special rites in their fasts, their burials, their ablutions, that differentiated them from other Christians. None of this altered the tranquility in which the communities in Arcos lived during the 2 generations before the 1568 revolt in Granada. It was not a unique situation. Reading the Times through the perspective of inquisitorial documents, one could be misled into imagining a permanent state of confrontation. Though there were important and periodic conflicts, what seems more striking is the absence of confrontation in many parts of Spain through much of the 16th century. It was in this period, too, that the Christians could afford still to entertain a romanticized vision of their links with Moriscos. With the appearance in 1565 of the romance, Aben Seraje y Harifa, a story of love between Christian and Muslim. Some Moriscos also took a universal view of religious truth. The Inquisition of Toledo tried one for saying that everyone should be allowed to practice his own religion. Another for maintaining, quote, that the Jew and the Muslim could each be saved in his own law, end quote. The ability of the communities to coexist was recognized and welcomed by many, but did not alter the fact that as a whole the Moriscos refused assimilation. Apart from culture, dress, and communal autonomy, the principal problem remained that of conversion, for they overwhelmingly rejected the type of Christianity offered to them. In 1513, Archbishop Talavera of Granada, who had encouraged his Moriscos to sing Arabic hymns at Mass, complained to the crown about cultural pressure upon them. Francisco Núñez Muli, a Morisco leader, who in his youth was page to Talavera, recalled how the archbishop went through the mountains of Granada to preach and say Mass. Since there was no organ for music, he made the natives play the zambra, a traditional dance, and during Mass always said the greeting, quote, "The Lord be with you," in Arabic. Quote, "I remember this," Núñez reminisced, as if it were yesterday. Many Christians, nobles, understood the need for some cultural tolerance. In 1514, the Count of Tendilla criticized Ferdinand's attempt to make Moriscos abandon their clothing. Quote, "What clothing did we use to wear in Spain? How did we wear our hair? What sort of food did we eat, if not in the Morisco style?" End quote. But the early missionary efforts were fruitless. When he went to Granada in 1526, Charles V was informed that, quote, "The Moriscos are truly Muslims. It is 27 years since their conversion, and there are not 27 or even 7 of them who are Christians," end quote. In Granada and Valencia, they held fast to their religion, observing prayers, fasts, and ablutions, and were strengthened in their faith by their clergy, the alfaquis. Had religious practice alone been at issue, social tension might not have been so high. But in the everyday contact with old Christians, there was periodic irritation and conflict over dress, speech, customs, and above all, food. Moriscos slaughtered their animal meat ritually, did not touch pork, the meat most commonly eaten in Spain, or wine, and cooked only with olive oil, whereas Christians cooked with butter or lard. They tended also to live apart in separate communities, which could lead to antagonism. For example, in Aragon, there was a friction between highland Christians, the Montañeses, and Moriscos living in the plains. Even in Castile, where the older Morisco communities were more assimilated, there were cases such as Hornachos, Extremadura, a flourishing and almost entirely Morisco town of 5,000 people, all of whom at the explosion of 1610 immigrated to Morocco. Though religious zeal was weaker in Castile and in those parts of Aragon where coexistence with Christians had diluted traditional practices, Islam endured because of community solidarity. In general, Moriscos were strongly repelled by the doctrines of the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus, and felt extreme repugnance at the sacraments of baptism. Families would watch the chrism off on returning home and hold a Muslim ceremony. Penitence in the Eucharist, Morisco irreverence at Mass was proverbial. There were many attempts to catechize them. From 1526, missionaries were sent out to Valencia and Granada. In the 1540s, a Franciscan Fray Bartolome de Los Angeles missionized Valencia. In the 1560s, further campaigns were conducted in Valencia by Jesuits and other clergy. In 1566, the Archbishop of Valencia, Martín de Ayala, published his manual, Christian Doctrine in Arab and Castilian. Ayala also tried with little success to find clergy who knew or could learn Arabic. Juan de Ribera, who became Archbishop of Valencia in 1568, initiated a financial scheme to increase the stipends of priests and to make work among the Moriscos more congenial to the clergy. He also helped to found a seminary and a college for Morisco boys and girls. For the 43 years that he held this seat, Ribera made every effort to travel around his bishopric and attend to the needs of the Moriscos. Considerable opposition to the missionary program in the crown of Aragon came from the seigneurs, who had opposed the forced conversions of 1526, and at every stage fought the activities of the Inquisition. In 1561, in Valencia, the Inquisitor Miranda appointed members of the rich Morisco family of Abbe Namir as familiars of the Inquisition. But the Duke of Segorbe, their overlord, ordered them to give up the appointment since his protection was sufficient for them. In 1566, the Inquisition of Aragon complained that the señores daily persecute the comisarios and familiars that the Holy Office has in their lands, expelling them and telling them that in their territory they want no Inquisition. It was in the nobles' interest to keep Morisco dependents under their control, since they were a substantial source of revenue. In various meetings of the Cortes, they pressed continually for Moriscos to be free from inquisitorial confiscations, a concession granted in the 1571 Concordia. There were conflicts between nobles and the Inquisition. In 1541, a prominent Valencian grandee, the Admiral of Aragon, Sancho de Moncada, was reprimanded by the Inquisition for building a mosque for his Moriscos and telling them, quote, that they should pretend to be Christians externally but remain Muslims internally, end quote. In 1569, he was placed under house arrest for 3 years for persistently protecting his Muslim vassals against the Holy Office. In 1571, the Grand Master of the Order of Montesa appeared in an auto de fe for protecting his Moriscos. In 1582, in Aragon, when the Lord of Ariza, Jaime Palafox, heard that the Inquisition had arrested 3 of his vassals, he and his men burst into the house of a familiar and beat and stabbed him to death. The court sent him for life to the North African fortress of Oran. Even had the nobles been more cooperative, it is unlikely that the Moriscos would have responded favorably to Christian overtures. Supported by the Taquilla, they defiantly maintained and proclaimed their separateness. Maria la Monja of Arcos in 1524 said, quote, that not for all the world would she cease saying that she had been a Muslim. So great a source of pride was it for her, end quote. The authorities, as the Granada regulations of December 1526 showed, were convinced that all Morisco customs were obstacles to the acceptance of Christianity. In 1538, a Morisco of Toledo was arrested by the Inquisition and accused of, quote, playing music at night, dancing the zambra, and eating kauskas, end quote, implying that these activities were heretical. In 1544, the Synod of the Bishopric of Guadix held that, quote, it is suspicious to take baths, especially on Thursday and Friday night, end quote. Even the Morisco manner of sitting, never on seats but always on the ground, could be viewed as Islamic. Tensions and conflicts were their most intense in the most Islamic of the Morisco territories, Granada. When all the repressive legislation was repeated in a pragmatic of January 1567 in Granada, Francisco Núñez Muli drew up a memorial protesting against the injustices done to his people. Quote, every day we are mistreated in every way, by both secular officials and clergy, all of which is so obvious that it needs no proof. How can people be deprived of their natural tongue in which they were born and raised? The Egyptians, Syrians, Maltese, and other Christian people speak, read, and write in Arabic, and are still Christians as we are. 2 generations of tension exploded finally into the Morisco revolt that began on Christmas Eve of 1568 in Granada and spread to the Alpujarras. It was a savage war between Christians and Muslims, with atrocities on both sides, and military repression was brutal. Thousands of Moriscos died. Over 80,000 were forcibly expelled from the kingdom and made to settle in Castile. The end of the rebellion did little to solve the problem. The Granadans brought into Castilian communities an Islamic presence they had not hitherto known, where Castile had about 20,000 mudejares. By the end of the century, the numbers had swelled to over 100,000, mostly Arabic in tongue and Muslim in culture. Moreover, the military threat was now obvious. Some 4,000 Turks and Berbers had come into Spain to fight alongside the insurgents in the Alpujarras. Morisco banditry in the south reached its peak in the 1560s. There were millenarian hopes of liberation from oppression, inevitably seeing the obduracy of the Moriscos. The authorities reverted to a repressive policy. The Granada War created a decisive change in attitudes. The excesses committed on both sides were without equal in the experience of contemporaries. It was the most savage war to be fought in Europe that century. Philip II was staggered by the massacres of priests committed by the rebels. The Moriscos, for their part, had suffered unspeakable atrocities. Apart from the deaths and explosions, thousands were sold into slavery within Spain. In Cordoba alone, in 1573, there were over 1,500 Morisco slaves. From that period, the attempts at conversion decreased and the repression intensified. Those expelled from Granada to the provinces of Castile took with them their Islamic beliefs and their hatred of Castile. In Arcos de Medinaceli, the older community of integrated Moriscos was pressurized by the newcomers to declare themselves openly as Muslims. From the 1570s in Aragon and Valencia, Moriscos formed the bulk of Inquisition prosecutions. In the Tribunal of Granada itself, Moriscos represented 82% of those prosecuted between 1560 and 1571. In the Tribunal of Cuenca, the arrival of the Granadans quintupled the number of Moriscos prosecuted, strengthened the faith of the Castilian Muslims, and provoked a wave of persecution by the Holy Office. In the Tribunal of Saragossa, 266 Moriscos were tried over the years 1540 through 59. Between 1560 and 1614, the total shot up to 2,371, a ninefold increase. In Valencia, there were 82 Morisco prosecutions in the earlier period, but 2,465 in the latter. A 30-fold increase in the autos de fe in both tribunals in the 1580s. Moriscos constituted up to 90% of all accused. The repression in Aragon was singularly harsh. Though the kingdom had only half as many Moriscos as Valencia, it suffered much higher rates of execution and condemnation to the galleys. All of them live as Muslims, and no one doubts this, end quote, the Inquisition of Aragon had affirmed in 1565. Throughout Spain, there is ample evidence that Moriscos were proud of their Islamic religion and fought to preserve their culture. Oppression only strengthened their separateness. Quote, they marry among themselves and do not mix with old Christians. None of them enters religion, nor joins the army, nor enters domestic service, nor begs alms. They live separately from old Christians, take part in trades, and are rich, end quote. Runs a report of 1589 made to Philip II on the Moriscos of Toledo. By contrast, for Moriscos, the inquisitors were, quote, thieving wolves whose trade in arrogance and greed, sodomy and lust, tyranny and robbery and injustice, end quote. The Inquisition was, quote, a tribunal of the devil attended by deceit and blindness, end quote. Even while the confrontation developed in some parts of Spain, there was peace between Christians and Muslims. In many communities, the continued coexistence of both cultures was accepted. In the area of La Sagra, Toledo, where Moriscos were some 5% of the population during the late 16th century, there was, quote, a peaceful and fruitful coexistence, end quote. In the province of Cuenca, coexistence was positive. In parts of Aragon, there was even occasional intermarriage between the communities. Some willingness to assimilate was demonstrated, moreover, by the case of the Leiden tablets of Granada. In 1588, and particularly in 1595, the astonishing discovery was made in a cave at Sacromonte. At Sacromonte, Granada, of a number of tablets apparently engraved in ancient Arabic and claiming to add information to the Christian revelation. Purporting to date from very early times, they depicted a form of Christianity in which features offensive to Muslims did not exist. A big controversy ensued, with many Christian authorities believing in their genuineness. A few Catholic scholars, such as the Hebraeus Benito Arias Montano, had doubts. Only in 1682 did Innocent XI pronounce the tablets to be fakes. The fraud had in fact been perpetrated by two prominent Moriscos, Miguel de Luna and Alonso del Castillo, who hoped to syncretize Islamic culture and Christian faith. It was an attempt to claim a place for Arabic Christianity within the framework of Iberian Catholicism. Despite continuing signs of convivencia, there were events which aggravated confrontation between Christian and Islamic civilization in Spain. In Granada, Moriscos were now, after the explosions, less than a tenth of the population, and the center of tensions moved to the huge Morisco community of Valencia. Here the military threat from the Ottoman Empire, backed up by piracy and coastal raids, made the authorities take steps to restrict and disarm Moriscos. The Alpujarra crisis of 1568-70 was followed opportunely by victory over the Turkish fleet at Lepanto in 1571. But Lepanto did not end fears of invasion. Morisco banditry in the south worsened after the 1570s. From this decade, French Protestant leaders were in touch with Aragonese Moriscos. Street riots between the communities took place. In Cordoba, there were serious incidents. In August 1578, provoked in part by open Morisco rejoicing at the destruction of the Portuguese army in the Battle of Alcázar el Quibir. In 1580, at Seville, a conspiracy abetting invasion from Morocco was discovered. In 1602, Moriscos were plotting with Henry IV of France. In 1608, the Valencia Moriscos asked for help from Morocco. The threat was powerful and real. Fear entered into the heart of Spain. By the 1580s, official opinion had moved in favor of a solution similar to that of 1492. In Lisbon, in 1581, Philip II convened a special committee to discuss the matter. In September of 1582, the Council of State formally proposed a general expulsion. The decision was approved by both Church and Inquisition. It was warmly supported by Martín de Salvatierra, Bishop of Sorgobe, who had in 1587 drawn up a memorial favoring expulsion, and by Archbishop Ribera, who, seeing the failure of his zealous attempts to convert the Moriscos, turned into their most implacable enemy. When Philip III came to the throne in 1598, it became clear that at all levels there were many who disagreed with the proposal of expulsion. No opinions in favor were expressed in the Cortes of Castile or in those of Valencia. Both the Duke of Lerma and the King's Confessor in 1602 opposed expulsion since, quote, "It would be terrible to drive baptized people into barbary and thus force them to turn Muslim." As late as 1607, the Crown's highest ministers preferred a policy of preaching and instruction. The publicists, arbitristas, of the period were uniformly opposed to expulsion. Gonzalo de Sayorrigo, in his memorial of 1600, denounced the idea. The nobility of the Crown of Aragon were solidly against any measure that would deprive them of their labor force. However, by 1609, the Duke of Lerma had changed his mind. He presented to the council a stated decision that the lords in Valencia, where his own estates lay, should be compensated by being given the lands of the expelled Moriscos. Opportunely, the lords were coming round to support expulsion. For years, their costs had been rising while the fixed rent from the Moriscos' vassals stagnated. There were moreover fears for security. Morisco population growth seemed uncontrollable. Between Alicante and Valencia on one side and Saragossa on the other, a huge mass of 200,000 Muslim souls appeared to be threatening Christian Spain. In Granada, there were further expulsions to counteract the rise in numbers. In Aragon, there had been 5,674 Moriscos in 1495, but in 1610 they numbered 14,190, a fifth of the population. In Valencia, the results of censuses made in 1565 and 1609 suggested that the old Christians might have increased by 44.7% and the Moriscos by a remarkable 69.7%. Quote, "Their aim was to grow and multiply like weeds," end quote, claimed a writer in 1612. Castration as a method of control was recommended in 1587 by Martín de Salvatierra. The expulsion was eventually decreed on the 4th of April 1609 and took places in stages up in 1614. Operations commenced in Valencia, which contained half of the Moriscos in the peninsula. It was therefore potentially the most dangerous province in all. About 30,000 Moriscos were expelled from a peninsular population of some 320,000. Although the human losses for the expulsion represented little more than 4% of Spain's population, the real impact in some areas was very severe. Where Moriscos had been a large minority, as in Valencia and in Aragon, there was immediate economic catastrophe. But even where there were few in number, the fact that they had largely active population, with no gentry or clergy or soldiers, meant that their absence could lead to dislocation. Tax returns fell and agricultural output declined. The Inquisition also faced a bleak future. In 1611, the tribunals of Valencia and Saragossa complained that the expulsion had resulted in their bankruptcy, since they were losing 7,500 ducats a year, which they had formerly received from ground rents. The Tribunal of Valencia, at the same time, acknowledged receiving some compensation, but claimed that a sum of nearly 19,000 ducats was still payable to it by the government to make up for what it had lost. A statement of revenue drawn up for the Tribunal of Valencia just before the expulsion of the Moriscos shows that 42.7% of its income derived directly from the Morisco population. A similar statement drawn up for the Inquisition of Saragossa in 1612 showed that since the expulsion, its revenue had fallen by over 48%. Within just over a century, with the support of the Inquisition, the authorities had carried out a radical surgery to exercise the excise from Spain in 1492 and in 1609, two of the three great cultures of the peninsula. Cardinal Richelieu, in his memoirs, described the Morisco expulsions as, quote, the most barbarous act in human annals, end quote. Cervantes, in his Don Quixote, makes a Morisco character, Ricote, applaud the heroic act of Philip III, quote, to expel poisonous fruit from Spain, now clean and free of the fears in which our numbers held her, end quote. Writers then and later closed their ranks and attempted to justify the operation. Many of the Valencian nobility had opposed expulsion, but Boronat, the leading historian of the Morisco question, glosses over their opposition and praises those few lords of pure blood and Christian heart, end quote, whose religion overrode their self-interest and made them support the measure. For the historian Florencio Janer, the expulsion was the necessary excision of, quote, an enemy race, end quote, from the heart of Spain. These uncompromising statements do not necessarily reflect the real opinion of people at that time. The attitude of the Inquisition in particular was neither uniform nor always hardline. In Valencia, for example, the inquisitors in 1582 were pessimistic about attempting to Christianize the Moriscos. Quote, in the 600 years that they have lived in Spain, we have seen few converted, end quote. They consequently proposed, quote, to expel all of them from Valencia and settle them in Old Castile, but not to send them to the Levant or Barbary, because, after all, they are Spaniards like ourselves, end quote. By the end of that year, the prospect of expulsion was already in sight. The Spanish Inquisition took no active part in the decision to expel, which was arrived at exclusively by a small group of court politicians. It continued, however, to act with severity against Moriscos accused of offenses against religion, and after 1609, those still in its cells were given to the unenviable choice of punishment or exile. Almost in its totality, Muslim Spain was rejected and driven into the sea. Thousands for whom there had been no other home were expelled to France, Africa, and the Levant. It was the last act in the creation of an orthodox society and completed the tragedy that had been initiated in 1492. In perspective, the expulsion seems to bear all the marks of inevitability, but despite official propaganda, there is little proof that it was supported unanimously by Spaniards. Opposition to the hard line was more widespread than is often assumed. The prominent writer Pedro de Valencia, writing before the decision had been taken, stated that, quote, expulsion is a harsh penalty and affects many innocent children, and no unjust course that offends God can benefit to the realm. It is a most malign policy of state. Fernandez de Navarrete, who attacked the expulsion of both Jews and Moriscos, as ill-advised, commented in 1626, quote, for princes to withdraw their trust from subjects, end quote. Given the enormous controversy aroused within Spain by the expulsions, it is not surprising that as late as 1690, the Moroccan envoy in Madrid could report having heard officials denounce the Duke of Lerma's responsibility for the act. No exceptions on the exclusively religious grounds were allowed in 1611 when it was proposed to expel the Moriscos of the valley of Ricote, a community of 6 towns in Murcia. A special report pointed out that the 2,500 inhabitants were truly Christian, but the expulsion still went ahead. Even so, the realm was not as cleansed from Islamic heresy as the zealots would have wished. A small proportion of Moriscos managed to obtain special permission to remain. They considered him part of the wealthy assimilated elite and in part of slaves. The Inquisitors themselves had allowed groups of apparently Christianized Moriscos to remain behind. Between 1615 and 1700, prosecutions of Moriscos made up about 9% of cases tried by the Inquisition. The incidents varied from only a single case in Valladolid to 197 in Valencia and 245 in Murcia. There continued, moreover, to be startling cases in later years, such as the group of wealthy Morisco families brought to trial in Granada in 1728. Many of those expelled also yearned to return home. An agent of the English government in Morocco in 1625 reported that Moriscos in exile were offering to supply men for an invasion of Spain. Quote, "Many have confessed to me that they are Christians. They complain bitterly of their cruel exile and desire deeply to return under Christian rule." End quote. Convivencia had vanished from Spain, but had religious peace and unity been achieved? End quote. So, yeah, that's the end of that chapter, which is the end of Morisco Spain, number 10. This is going to be number 11, Racialism and Its Critics. This is the Spanish Inquisition. And yeah, chapter 11 is Racialism and Its Critics. See how many more. Inquisition and the People. We got a few more chapters in here. It appears. Yeah, we got maybe 4 more chapters. Drawing near the end of it. Well, thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium. All of these are Marxists, so y'all can hit me up there. Y'all have a great day. And Bodada Goi.